For almost 500 years, a whole European society existed right on the edge of the known world, in Greenland. They built churches, they farmed the land, they even traded with kings. And then, poof, they were gone. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a full-blown detective story. Okay, let's dive into this puzzle and see if we can piece together what on earth happened to the lost Norse colony of Greenland. I want you to just picture this for a second. It's sometime in the 1540s. A ship of Icelandic sailors gets blown way off course and lands on the coast of Greenland. They're probably expecting to find, a bustling settlement. But instead, all they find is silence. And then they find him, a single body face down on the beach, the last Norseman anyone would ever see. This haunting discovery, well, it's our first major clue. So this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's fascinated historians and archaeologists for centuries. How does a society that lasted for half a millennium, that's longer than the United States has even existed, just disappear off the face of the earth? All they left behind were some ruins and a couple of really eerie accounts. To solve this mystery, the first thing we have to do is really understand the silence. Because see, the disappearance wasn't some single big event. It was more like a slow, creeping fade to black that happened over decades. Now, what's really wild about this timeline is how everything just stops. In 1408, we get the last definitive, detailed record we have, a wedding at Helvesi Church. Okay. 2 years later, the last ship we know of sails away. And after that, just quiet. Decades go by. Then, in 1448, Pope Nicholas V writes this letter about a barbarian attack from years before, but even he admits he doesn't have certain knowledge of what's going on. Then, almost a whole century after that, we get that final, grim discovery of the man on the beach. Contact didn't just stop, it literally evaporated. So, to really understand what was lost, we need to rewind the clock. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, to see the world these Vikings built at the very edge of everything. The whole story starts with this one guy who was, let's be honest, part explorer and part marketing genius, Erik the Red. He gets exiled from Iceland for murder around 982 AD, so he sails west and finds this massive icy island. He checks out its southwestern fjords and then sails back to Iceland with just a brilliant sales pitch. He called this new place Greenland. As the saga tells us, he figured people would be way more willing to go if the land had a good name. And you know what? It worked. In 985, a whole fleet of 25 ships set sail, 14 made it, and the European settlement of Greenland officially began. And for centuries, they didn't just scrape by, they were actually thriving. They set up 3 main settlements, the eastern, the western, and the middle settlements. At its absolute peak, the population was probably somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 people. There were farmers, raising cattle, sheep, and goats. But their real connection to the outside world, their whole economic engine, was trade. They hunted walrus for their ivory tusks, which were incredibly valuable in Europe. In return, they imported stuff they absolutely couldn't make themselves, like iron for tools and wood for building ships. This trade was their lifeline. No exaggeration. For centuries, this whole model worked pretty well. But the thing is, the Norse had settled Greenland during a really lucky break in the climate. And that luck, well, it was about to run out. Their world was about to get much, much colder. Okay, let's look at this timeline, because this might be one of the most important clues in the whole mystery. The Norse showed up during the medieval warm period, a time when temperatures were mild enough to make their farming lifestyle possible. But then, around 1300, the climate started to shift. The Little Ice Age began to set in. By the early 1400s, things got intense. Ice core samples show that summer temperatures plummeted by as much as 6 to 8 degrees Celsius. For a society living on the absolute knife edge of survival, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a full-blown catastrophe. And this chart right here, this perfectly illustrates the real-world impact of that climate shift. Archaeologists analyzed bones from Norse cemeteries, and what they found is just staggering. In the 13th century, about 80% of their diet came from their farm animals, classic European farmer food. But just a century later, that number had completely flipped. By the 14th century, 80% of their diet was coming from the sea, mostly seals. They weren't just supplementing their diet anymore. The cold had forced them to totally abandon their traditional way of life. They had to become marine hunters to survive. And as if a climate crisis wasn't enough to deal with, the Norse suddenly weren't alone anymore. Around the 12th century, a new group of people began migrating into their territories from the north. Thule, the ancestors of the modern Inuit.
and they brought with them a toolkit that had been perfected over centuries for Arctic survival. Things like super-fast kayaks for hunting on the open sea, and these ingenious toggle-headed harpoons. Unlike the Norse, they weren't just surviving in the Arctic, they were absolute masters of it.
So we've got the scene set, a struggling European colony, a climate that's getting worse and worse, and the arrival of a perfectly adapted Arctic people. Now let's put the final pieces of the puzzle together and see what the evidence tells us about what happened next. This comparison. This is really the heart of the whole story. The Norse were, at their core, a European farming culture that they had basically tried to copy and paste into the Arctic. Their entire world depended on raising livestock and keeping that fragile trade link to Norway open for iron and wood. They never really learned the Thule's advanced hunting techniques. The Thule, on the other hand, were a self-sufficient culture born of the Arctic. They had the technology and the skills not just to get by in the intense cold, but to actually thrive in it. So the crucial takeaway here is that there was no single smoking gun. It was a perfect storm, really, just a cascade of failures. The climate got colder, which made farming basically impossible. Their own practices, like chopping down all the trees for fuel and building, caused soil erosion, which just made things worse. Then their main export, walrus ivory, crashed in price as cheaper ivory from Africa and Russia flooded the European market. And just like that, their economic lifeline was severed. Suddenly, they couldn't afford the iron for their tools or the wood for their ships. And all the while, they were facing more and more competition for scarce resources from the incredibly well-adapted Thule, which, yeah, probably led to conflict. It's so important to remember this. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm. It was a slow, grim decline over several generations. I mean, can you imagine watching your pastures fail, your cattle die, and realizing the ships from home just aren't coming anymore? Imagine feeling your whole world shrink, year after year, until there's nothing left. They didn't just disappear. Their entire world was ground down by change that happened too much, too fast. But while that chapter was closing for the Norse, the story of Greenland itself was far from over. The Thule-Inuit thrived, becoming the sole inhabitants of this huge island. And then, after centuries of silence, Europe returned, looking for the ghosts of the past, and a whole new chapter began. And this timeline shows you exactly how that new chapter unfolded. It all started back in 1721, when a Danish-Norwegian missionary named Hans Egede showed up. He was actually looking for the lost Norse settlers, but only found Inuit, and that kicked off a whole new colonial period. Fast forward to 1953, and Greenland's status was upgraded from a colony to a county within Denmark. The really big shifts, though, came in 1979 with Home Rule, which created a local Greenlandic government. And then finally, in 2009, the Act on Self-Governance transferred most of the remaining powers to Greenland and made Greenlandic the only official language, a huge step towards autonomy. And if you want just one single moment that perfectly captures Greenland's drive for self-determination, this is it. In 1985, after a vote, Greenland became the only territory to ever leave what we now call the European Union. They were worried that membership would let foreign companies overfish their waters, and they chose to protect their resources and go their own way. So today, Greenland is this vibrant, self-governing nation. Its small population is navigating some huge challenges and opportunities. Everything from the social legacies of colonization to its growing strategic importance now that the Arctic ice is melting. It's a land that's defined not by what was lost, but by the incredible resilience of the people who remain. And that brings us to our final thought. The story of the Norse Greenlanders is a stark, 500-year-long cautionary tale. They were a complex, resilient society that, in the end, failed because they couldn't, or maybe wouldn't, adapt to a new environmental reality. As we face our own global climate crisis, their story really echoes across the centuries with a powerful and, honestly, a pretty unsettling question.